ban in high school and college basketball in the United States. And it's one of those things you just kind of glance over. And every time there's an explanation for it, it's always summed up by someone saying, well, it was because Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, came into UCLA and he was taller than everybody and better than everybody and dunking over everybody, and they had to ban it because of him. Right. Okay, well, who's the they? Like, how did this happen? Who made the decision? And what was the discussion leading up to it? And what precipitated this? I had some theories, but I wanted to kind of get to the bottom of it. And that moment kind of convinced me to kind of take the book in the direction that I ended up taking, which was the theory that the dunk has been an engine of change, not just in basketball, but in America itself. That it's in a way kind of a tangible symbol of the way America has evolved over time. Racially, the idea that the dunk was kind of a form of Black, a response, an assertion of strength in the face of what Black Americans were encountering during the Civil Rights Movement, a symbol of defiance, culturally, a symbol of cool. I mean, you could do a PhD thesis on the implications of masculinity in the idea of someone getting dunked on during a game. So once I thought about the ban, that kind of took me into several different places and avenues and themes that I could explore in the book. And the joy of doing the research for the book was it not only took me to those places, it took me to places that I couldn't even conceive of when I began. And I'll tell one quick little story about the research for the book, and then I'll open it up to questions. So the book bounces around quite a bit. Each chapter is the whole thing is very episodic. Each chapter kind of stands on its own as a lengthy magazine style piece, something like that. So there's the longest chapter in the book, for instance, is about Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell in 1955, just limited to the year 1955, because that was the year that Wilt was a senior at Overbrook High School and was an absolute phenom nationally, getting written about all over the place. And it was also the year that Bill Russell led the University of San Francisco to the first of its back-to-back national championships. They beat my alma mater. They beat LaSalle and Tom Golan in 1955. So that year marked Russell and Chamberlain entering the national consciousness at the same time for the same reason. They were lifting the sport above the rim. You know, Gola, it was a hero of mine as a kid, represented everything that basketball had been. He was gentlemanly. He was regal. He was an incredible team player. You know, he was the son of a cop. He represented one aspect of America at that time. But then Russell came along and San Francisco came along and they represented something entirely different. They were going to take the sport in an entire new direction than what Gola had done and promised for the sport. So to get to the quick anecdotal story about research. So it took me, you know, the telling of that story was interesting. Telling the story of David Thompson, who some of you may have heard of, a great player at North Carolina State in the early 1970s, who could not dunk when he was in college because of the ban. I mean, this guy was the precursor to Michael Jordan and to all the high flyers who came after him, and yet he couldn't dunk in college. But my favorite chapter to work on was about a guy named Joe Fortenberry from Happy, Texas. Happy, Texas has fewer than 1,000 people. It's in West Texas. And I went down there. Joe's since passed away, but his son, Oliver, is still alive and lives in Amarillo. So the reason I wanted to talk and write about Joe, wanted to talk to Walter and write about Joe Fortenberry, was that Joe was really credited nationally with bringing the dunk to prominence. In 1936, he was playing on a semi-pro team in Oklahoma, and they had an exhibition game in Madison Square Garden. And a writer from the New York Times happened to be there. And the writer noticed in the pregame warmups that Fortenberry, who was about 6'7", 6'8", and another of his teammates were, as the writer put it, dropping the ball through the hoop as if they were a patron dunking a roll into coffee. And that was really the first time that the words dunk and basketball had been linked in any significant way. And because it was the New York Times, the terminology kind of took off from there. And you start to see it in Newsweek, Time Magazine, and before you know it, everybody's referring to the dunk. Doesn't necessarily mean Joe Fortenberry was the first person to dunk, just means that the term got connected to him. So, as it turns out, Joe went on from that game to be the best player on the 1936 U.S. Men's Olympic basketball team. Anybody know where the 36 Olympics were? Germany. Where in Germany? Berlin. Who was in charge of Berlin at that time? We all know. So that's the Olympics of Jesse Owens. That's the Olympics of the boys in the boat. That's the Olympics of Lani Riefenstahl. And here is this story that nobody pays any attention to. It was also the first Olympics where basketball was actually a competition. So Joe Fortenberry is the best player on the first U.S. men's Olympic basketball team of all time, and he's known for dunking the ball. So basically, the dunk was an excuse for me to go full Eric Larson and write a 6,000-word chapter about Germany and the ship that the team took over to Berlin, and Fortenberry's encounter with Hitler, and the fact that they won this game 19-8. It's one of the typos I have in the book. They got the final score wrong in that game. I typed a 5 instead of an 8, so the final score was actually 19-8. But it was this wonderful tale. And so I flew down to Amarillo, Texas to meet with Joe's son, Oliver, and talk to him because Oliver had kept all of Joe's memorabilia, every single article that was written about him. I actually went to his house and got to hold Joe's 1936 Olympic gold medal. Heavier than you might think. And then Oliver says, well, I'm going to take you to where Daddy learned how to play basketball. So we drive from Amarillo to Happy, Texas, and I have a rented RAV4. And we go off-roading into this gigantic strip of farmland. You know, brown grass, brown as the eye can see. There's a barn that looks like a gray blob near the horizon. And we're driving towards this barn, and I said, Oliver, are we really going to go all the way to this barn? He's like, no. Actually, that's not where the barn was. Daddy's barn was right about here. Stop, and we'll get out. Said, all right, so I pull over in the middle of this giant piece of farmland and throw the car in the park, turn it off, and before I get out, and there's nothing around. Before I get out, he says, just one thing. Watch out for rattlesnakes. Truly. Oh shit. Am I gonna get bitten by a freaking rattlesnake while I'm standing there? Needless to say, got out of the car, like looked around, everything seemed cool. I'm like, this is it, Oliver, this is it. Yeah, Daddy's barn was right here. I'm like, well, it's not here now. Let's get the hell back to the car. And then it ended up driving to Happy High School, which is where Joe went to high school, and they actually have a kind of a shrine to him in the lobby of the high school. It felt like being in the gym in the movie Hoosiers. It kind of had that like wood paneling kind of feel to the whole school. So that was actually my most enjoyable research venture. I went down to Raleigh, North Carolina for a couple of days to research David Thompson, to research Lorenzo Charles, who some of you may remember from the 1983 national championship that he won with the dunk for NC State. Unfortunately, we won't be seeing any more Cinderella runs like that in the NCAA tournament now that college players are getting paid like professional athletes. They've been for a while. So that's my spiel. How long has what been?
NIL.
What, 2 or 3 years now, I guess, since the House decision. Yeah. So anyway, that's my spiel. As I said, I don't want to talk at you. I would much rather have all of you take us where we're going to go. So if you have a question about the books, you have a question about Philadelphia sports, about journalism, anything I can use to embarrass my old classmate, I'm happy to. Yes.
Are you having trouble?
Yes,
watching
with
NBA
everything.
games right now?
Am I having trouble watching NBA games? Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so, and I get into that in the book. The athletes and the players have never been better, never been more skilled, never been taller, more athletic, faster in every regard. What's missing to me is the thing that made basketball great for a long, long time, which is the spontaneity and the improvisational nature of the sport. Everything now, at least most of the sport, is predicated on efficiency. It's predicated on why shoot a 19-foot 2-point shot when you can shoot a 23-foot 3-point shot, and the math is winning out. I mean, if you follow basketball at any level, follow sports at any level, you're familiar with this idea. It took over baseball for the better part of 10 years. Now they've changed the rules to try to swing the pendulum back. I think basketball needs to do something similar because it's getting predictable for the most. Now there are still wonderful players, you know, Nikola Jokic. I don't know if you saw the pass he made the other night. That was brilliant. And there are wonderful, wonderful players, but maybe I'm different from most basketball fans now. I would much rather see Allen Iverson shake and bake a guy on the perimeter and pull up for a 19-footer in a guy's face, or drive the lane against the Shaquille O'Neal and go up over him and feather in a teardrop layup over a bigger player and then get knocked to the floor. I'd rather see Kobe Bryant, use his impeccable footwork to get off a 20-footer turnaround with a guy in his face. The efficiency has lessened the degree of difficulty of so much of what players do on the court now. That's taken some of the entertainment out of that. And everybody's trying to play the same way. You don't have this kind of contrast of styles, And some of this, I'm sure, is just nostalgia on my part for the way things used to be. I'm sure if I went back and watched a Chicago Bulls Orlando Magic game from 1997, I'd be like, this is boring. Everybody's fouling each other, and et cetera, et cetera. But I can't help how I feel. And I do find it harder. I find it harder, never mind the other issues of load management and the question of whether a star player from a particular team is going to be playing in a particular night. You didn't have that issue. Magic Johnson played every game. Michael Jordan played every game. Dominique Wilkins and Larry Bird played every game. My God, Isaiah Thomas, if you remember the 1988 finals, sprained his ankle, practically broke it, and it swelled up to this size. And he went out and scored 28 points or something, 25, I think it was, in a third quarter alone, because it meant that much to him. So now I really sound like a guy who's about to turn 50. But that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And what I think it's eventually going to lead to kind of tie a bow on this is, because there are so many players now, or at least an increasing number of players, who are so tall and so mobile and so athletic, that I think eventually, maybe not next year, maybe not 5 years from now, but the NBA is going to have to start thinking about raising the rim. Because you look at what draws people to sports, I think, as much as anything, if not more than anything, is a sense of wonder. And these players now are almost too good. You look at Victor Wembanyama from the San Antonio Spurs. He is 7'3". He can run like a gazelle. And before he suffered the blood clot condition that ended his season, had made the second most three-pointers from beyond 25 feet in the league this year. Now that's crazy. That's a crazy level of skill and versatility wrapped up in one player who's 21 years old.
Or this is Steph Curry?
He was tied with Steph Curry. Not sheer three-pointers from beyond, I think, 23 feet. So he had made more long threes than everybody except one other player in the league. So if you have a guy who's 7'3" doing that, and when he's near the basket, he reaches up and just drops it in, you're missing the excitement, the view, the view that what they're doing is actually beyond what mere mortals can do. It just looks too easy.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
But right now, some of the best players ever, Jokic, Steph Curry, others, they're the best and most entertaining players ever, but the game itself is not entertaining, and I can't figure that out.
Yeah, I think some of the stylistic aspects are part of it. I think the NBA has done a poor job of marketing the league from a rivalry standpoint based on the teams. Celtics Lakers doesn't mean what it used to mean. Sixers Celtics doesn't mean what it used to mean. Knicks Heat doesn't mean what it used to mean. They have decided that they're going to market the individual stars. And you see that now, that more and more fans root for a particular player as opposed to a particular team. And I'm a big believer that sports is the best avenue for tribalism that we have in our society. Tribalism can take us into some really bad places, but at its best, like my team against your team is like the best kind of hatred you can have. And I think the NBA is missing a lot of that. Yes.
You stole my thunder with the rivalries. I mean, I go back when ABC had the Sunday game of the week, and we used to look forward to that. Now that every night there's 9 games on.
Yeah, and there's the issue of scarcity, right? When something is scarce, it's going to have more value. Our president doesn't seem to figure that out, But that's what's happening here. Is that if you got one game a week, I mean that applies to any sport in particular, right? When there was one Monday Night Football game, everybody watched Monday Night Football. Now the games are spread out, and even NFL games are spread out. Thursday night, you know, you have a couple at 1 o'clock on Sunday, a couple at 4 o'clock on Sunday. You have one at Sunday night and one on Monday night. And then eventually we're just gonna have one every night of the week.
But expansion has really destroyed the rivalries. I mean, I remember the original 6 in hockey and when 9 teams were in the NBA and, you know, and Chamberlain and Russell used to play 18 games a year.
Yeah,
You know,
familiarity
all that
breeds
is gone.
contempt. Yep,
All that is gone.
yep. Yes.
You know, the other thing I find is destroying the game is the rate of injury. You look at any team, you know, the Sixers are the epitome of this, but across the league, and it's getting worse and worse. The number of injured players often exceeds the number of available players, or these regular roster players on teams. And is this because of the nature of the game, or is it the players being pampered?
I don't know if it's players being pampered as much as, you know, I think there's something to be said for players almost being too physically conditioned. I think there's something to the idea that because teams invest so much money in superstar athletes, that they are going to be infinitely more cautious about making sure that athlete is back to full health. And the athlete himself is going to be more cautious about it. You know, back in the day when Chuck McNarick was pouring concrete in the off seasons when he wasn't playing linebacker or center for the Eagles, or Sandy Koufax wasn't getting paid $15 to $30 million a year. Okay, you know, Bednaric's going to go out there if his elbow tendon is hanging, and Koufax is going to dip his arm into a bucket of ice after throwing a 16 strikeout, 160 pitch complete game, and then go out there 5 days later because this was their livelihoods, and they were only making so much money that, you know, the players' salaries didn't outstrip the average Joe's salaries to the degree it does now. So that dynamic changes things too. But, you know, I think the sport has gotten a little bit faster in some respects. I do think we are hampered looking back at the old days by not knowing how often, with all due respect to those old guys, what nights were they just mailing it in? You know, what nights were they? Like the night Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points. How much defense were the Knicks playing that night? Did they really want to be in Hershey? I mean, come on. You know, come on. So we like to think that the good old days are always better, but that's not necessarily the case. And maybe they weren't suffering as many injuries because they weren't putting themselves as frequently in position to be injured.
Fans can't count on their favorite players
No.
showing up anymore. Whether it's injury or rest or whatever.
No, that's right. And the NBA's got a big problem in that regard. It does.
What can be done about it?
I think you're gonna have to get a star player to, for lack of a better phrase, change that culture. I don't know any other way around it, because it's shifted so much now. It's, once a permission structure has been put in place to be able to allow players to take nights off, for teams to okay it.
I lived in Chicago when the Bulls were the Bulls, and Michael Jordan once said that he doesn't take a night off because he knows there's a kid out
Right,
there who
yeah.
gets to go to one game a year,
Yeah.
maybe if he's lucky, and he wants to be there for that kid. He wants
Yeah,
to perform.
But there's, and I think that still is true, but there are so many more athletes who would say, or so many more people involved in professional sports who would say, come on, you can watch any team you want, any night of the week. It's all available, you know, just pay for DirecTV, pay for YouTube TV. It's all available. We're spoiled to a certain degree. Yes.
The NBA All-Star Dunk Contest has gone down the tubes. None of the superstars are entering the dunk contest. In the past 2 years, Mac McClung,
Past
who
3
is-
years.
3 years, isn't even in the NBA.
Correct.
And he wins it.
Right.
He can dunk. That's messed up.
Yeah, it is, but it is messed up. And I actually have a chapter in Magic in the Air, focused solely on the 1988 dunk contest at Chicago Stadium, which came down to Michael Jordan against Dominique Wilkins. And I argue that that's the pinnacle of the dunk.
Yeah.
Because you had the best player in the league and one of the best players in the league going mano a mano, treating the dunk contest like it was game 7 of the NBA finals. What you have now is a product, I think in large part of the fact that it gets back to what I said earlier about the lack of wonder. We feel like we've seen everything that a player can do dunking the ball on a 10-foot rim. Part of the reason they bring Mac McClung back, and if you're not familiar with Mac McClung, he's a 6'2" white dude who played at Georgetown and then Texas Tech, and has spent virtually his entire professional basketball career in the G League, in the minor league, except right before the All-Star break, when the dunk contest is coming up, he signs with an NBA team for about a week, participates in the dunk contest, wins it, and then goes back to the G League. So he's like a hired gun. It's like having Shane come in and win the dunk contest. Right, he did it for the Sixers a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
The reason that they're doing that is because Mac McClung number one, upends every stereotype we have about who should be good at dunking, right? He's a 6'2" white kid from Southern Virginia.
Right.
Okay. So it's a novelty to see this guy who looks this way dunk the ball the way he does.
Right.
More to the point of the question I was answering earlier, because he's 6'2" and white, the common fan's perception of what they see him do is filled with a greater sense of wonder. You appreciate it more because you say to yourself, how is this 6'2" white kid doing this?
Right,
You're not saying that when the 6'8" black guy does it.
right.
So the common fan looks at that and says, oh, that's amazing that he can do that. They don't look at the Kobe Bryant or, pick your Anthony Edwards, pick your high-flying guy in the league now, Vince Carter. They don't look at those guys now and say, well, okay, of course he can do it. And I've seen it before. So I don't know how you get out of that. I mean, I don't know, maybe the dunk contest just lost its mojo. Yeah.
Talk to us about the 5'7" Spud Webb, because that's the very first one I remember.
Yeah, he won the dunk contest in 1986. And he's mentioned in that chapter because he competed in 1988 and finished 5th or 6th. He didn't do well. But for him to win, and he was 5'7" tall, won the dunk contest in 1986. Jordan was injured at the time and couldn't compete. And Spud actually beat Dominique Wilkins. And at that time, that was all it took for a guy like him to become a national celebrity. I mean, he went and won the dunk contest and it was on the Tonight Show, like within the same week. He's sitting down with Johnny Carson. The membrane separating like backup point guard from the Atlanta Hawks from like national superstar because he won the dunk contest was just that thin. So I talked to Spud for a while. He actually taught himself how to dunk. He was the only guy as a kid playing with a bunch of other older guys who couldn't dunk. And he like devoted himself to, increasing his vertical leap so that he could do it. And he was actually a great player in college at NC State. And was actually a pretty good pro, like backed up Doc Rivers with the Hawks in the mid-1980s. Yes.
You work alongside Rob Ellis.
I do.
Saturday. He's one of my favorite WIP guys.
Mine too.
Yeah, I think he's great. I also listen to Joey Mack, Paul Jolovitz, Ginger.
Sure.
Like what's your approach for what do you think it makes a good WIP host? What do you guys strive to do?
That's a great question. I'm gonna tell you the very first thing we strive to do, whether it was me, and by we, I mean either me and Rob or me and Glenn. And I think Glenn and Ray had the same approach. If we went through a 3-hour show and didn't take a single phone call, that would be cool with us. Because our philosophy is that, generally speaking, nobody is listening to a sports talk show to hear Joe from Kensington, or to hear Bob from South Philly, or to hear Jim from Medford. They're not the experts. They're not the entertainers. They're not the ones who are being paid to be on the radio. We are. And I know that sounds arrogant, but I have found myself over the years, if I've had sports talk stations, I turn it off when a caller comes on because they're generally not accustomed to speaking on the radio. They either want to hear themselves talk, or they ask a question that is pretty obvious, or they make a point that is pretty obvious or pretty silly. And unless you want to use the callers as fodder to beat up on them and yell and scream,
Howard Eskin, like Howard Eskin.
no comment. There isn't much good in having them on. Now Rob and I have maybe 5 or 6 callers on each show. But generally speaking, they're gonna be people who we know. We have a couple people who call the show every week, and they're generally pretty good. But I'm much more conditioned, even more than Rob, to like, all right, he's starting to wander, she's starting to want get him off the air, because I don't want people to turn us off. And that's the thing. The approach that we have, and I can only speak for myself and Rob and myself and Glenn. The approach that we have, and Glenn defined it really well, is that we want to be the 2 cool uncles at the family barbecue who are talking about sports or movies or whatever's going on. And, you know, we don't scream and yell at you, and we don't sound obnoxious, and we don't have to tell you our opinion just for the sake of telling you our opinion. We're gonna have a cool conversation with you, the audience. And that's why, like, for instance, Rob and I kept one of the features of Glenn and Ray's show, which was the What We're Watching segment. Every week at 11:30, we talk about if we've seen a movie, if we're streaming a show, if we've seen a documentary. Maybe we'll talk about an old movie that we just rewatched for the first time in a while, because we want to kind of open it up to as many people as we possibly can. We're not there for the hardest of hardcore fans. We're for like the mom or dad who's taking their kids to soccer practice and happen to have they're in the car and they have the radio on, or you're cutting your grass and you're listening, or you're just sitting around having a cup of coffee. You know, we're not going to get into the weeds with, oh, who's the Eagles' backup left tackle going to be? Like, that's not us. That's not just. Yes.
And with college basketball and football and the effect of NIL and the transfer portal, would you care to predict the end game of where the NCAA is?
I mean, it depends on what kind of rules they get around to setting up. I mean, I think the Power Four are eventually just going to break away because they're going to have that football money, and they're going to be able to outspend everybody for everything. I don't know how a school like St. Joe's or LaSalle is going to be able to compete at the Division I level. I mean, I don't know if you all saw this, but last week, St. Francis of Pennsylvania qualified for the NCAA tournament for, I think, the first time in its history. It was a number 16, won its conference tournament, was a number 16 seed, got beat in the first round, and then within a week, dropped down from Division I to Division III. Within a week of getting to the NCAA tournament for the first time, because they read the writing on the wall. But we simply, it doesn't do us any good to stay at the Division I level. I think my alma mater is not necessarily headed in that direction, but LaSalle's in the Atlantic 10, and LaSalle does not have the wide swath of alumni with deep pockets to be able to fund NIL and pay for play in the way that a Duke can, or a North Carolina can, or a Villanova can. So until the NCAA and these conferences and these power brokers kind of set some rules for themselves, I don't know where we're headed. I don't know. All I know is right now, Cinderella is she's dead. She can't compete. Yes.
How long did it take you to write that book, and when did you start thinking about it?
It took me about 1.5 years to finish the manuscript. I started thinking about it in late 2022, and then worked on it throughout the rest of that year, and then 2023, and then turned in my first draft of the manuscript early last year. My publisher, St. Martin's Press, needs about 1 year to be able to look over, have my editor look over the manuscript, make any suggestions, recommendations, changes, and then they kick it back to me, and then I have to go through it again, catch some typos. There are plenty of typos in that thing.
But if for the 19-5 score, can we maybe whenever whoever gets the book, just put a pen in. You could do the 5, because when it's a 5, you can just put like.
I wish I could. I'd have to find every single book. But yeah.
If you get the book.
Thanks. And you have to, it's a long process. You have to gather photographs. They send you what are called galleys, which are kind of like, rough drafts of the book. And then they want to try to start a marketing campaign, that kind of thing. So it takes a long while. Yes, sir. Great question. So I did a lot of interviews for the book. If a particular chapter was about an athlete who had passed away, I tried to track down his or her family members. If the athlete was still around and alive, I tried to interview him or her. So I talked to Dominique Wilkins. I talked to Julius Erving. I talked to people who knew Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, people like that. I talked to John Morant. First chapter of the book is about John Morant from the Memphis Grizzlies, and I got to speak to him and spoke to a few current NBA players. There's a great website called newspapers.com, which is an archive of virtually every newspaper article that's been written since the early 19th century. And if you type in a name, if I type in David Thompson, 1975, boom, every article about David Thompson that appeared in a newspaper in America in 1975 is at my fingertips, and I can dig some material out of that. Jeff Bezos is a multi-billionaire because of me. I spent a small fortune on books on Amazon.
Could use a library.
I know, but I like to have the book. I like to be able to write them.
Stores.
Yes,
Putting it
an independent bookstore.
Sorry.
And libraries.
And
I
libraries,
never
yes.
stopped about being a librarian.
I live a mile and a half from the Doylestown Bookshop.
Right.
And
Yes.
it's a great place.
Sure.
Spend a ton of money. But yeah, that's what you have to do. I like to do interviews. I watched a lot of YouTube videos of games, dunk contests, and there were some interviews on YouTube that I could watch and transcribe and get some insights from there. So you use a lot of different resources, lots and lots. Yes, sir.
You wrote a chapter which brought back wonderful memories for me from my youth. The most spectacular player I ever, not the best, most spectacular, who played in the era when the NBA had a color quota.
Mhm.
Played in the old Eastern League. And he was a legend of in the Rucker League, the jumping. Jackie Jackson. And even Bob Bryant, is it Bob Bryant?
Yep.
He said he could outjump Julius Erving, Michael Jordan, Dominique Wilkins.
Yeah.
What was your research on that?
Sure. So I didn't know anything about jumping Jackie Jackson until I saw Bob Ryan. Bob Ryan is the longtime basketball writer and columnist at the Boston Globe.
That's right.
He's been on ESPN's Around the Horn for years and years,
Yeah.
sports reporters before that, very well known basketball writer. I saw Bob at the 2023 Big East tournament in Madison Square Garden. We were standing in the area where the media eat dinner before the game. So like we were right by a table, like with these tureens of terrible coffee and like stale turkey and cheese sandwiches and all this stuff. And I said, Bob, I'm doing this book about, the slam dunk and what it means to basketball. And he says, you got to have Jumpin' Jackie Jackson in there. Bob is from Trenton. He went to Lawrenceville Prep. Yeah, and he went on for 10 minutes in the middle of the Madison Square Garden media dining area about Jumpin' Jackie Jackson. He's waving his hands like he's Bruce Lee or something like that. He's flying chop in the air. Jumpin' Jackie Jackson played for Trenton in the Eastern League, and I saw him do this dunk, and he twirled around and he slammed it down above, and people were looking at us, and I'm like, okay, so I was recording the whole thing, and that was the beginning of my chapter on Jumpin' Jackie Jackson. And I got in touch with Jackie passed away a few years ago, but I got in touch with his son-in-law, who had been collaborating with Jackie on a memoir. And the son-in-law, he hadn't finished it, but the son-in-law emailed me the unfinished memoir. So I had 60 pages of Jackie Jackson quotes, even though I never interviewed him, to go back to your question about research. And then I was able to do some more research, books, articles. Jackie played for the Harlem Globetrotters in the 70s. And so I wanted to include at least one, if not more than one, figure like him in the book, the kind of guy who was a legend of the playgrounds, but for one reason or another, never made it to the NBA. Maybe he couldn't shoot a jump shot. Maybe like Earl the Goat Manigault, who the next chapter is about, he was a heroin addict. And he had a self-destructive tendency that kept him from reaching the level that he should have reached. Earl the Goat was called by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who Alcindor called him the best player he ever saw. But he never made it to the NBA because of his drug addiction. So I wanted some of that too. I wanted kind of the gritty grassroots city feel of the dunk. not necessarily at the highest level. So, I want to get somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. Yes, ma'am.
Do you or have you ever covered women's basketball?
There's a chapter in the book about women's basketball and the pioneers of dunking in women's basketball. I've covered I went to the Olympics in July last year, July and August. So I got to cover the women's basketball team a couple of times there, including the gold medal game. And covered other women's sports. I did a lot of fencing, actually. My older son fences. So I got to write about fencing, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I do cover women's basketball from time. I've written about the Immaculata teams from the early 70s. Kathy Rush and Teresa Brents and those great teams. So yeah.
To follow up on her question, it seems that you find that professional men's basketball doesn't have the same appeal as it once had, but women's basketball is having some kind of a moment.
Yes.
Do you think it's reactionary, and do you think it's able to be sustained?
I think it's going to be sustained for a while because Title IX has been around for a half century now. So you have so many young girls who don't consider it. They don't look at it like they're breaking any glass ceilings by playing sports. It's just what they do. And there are so many of them coming up through the ranks, and their moms and their dads now have these athletes to point to and say, you can be like Angel Reese, you can be like Caitlin Clark. And I think the Clark moment was a really interesting one to me. There's a lot of discussion about why she penetrated the marketplace and the broader consciousness in the way that she did. And I think it has a lot to do with what we were talking about earlier about the way professional basketball has changed. And in that Steph Curry was kind of the pioneer of like really turning pro basketball, and to a lesser degree college basketball, into a three-point contest, right? Now he's the greatest shooter of all time and can dribble behind his back and shake a guy and then from 25 feet let it go. But the NBA saw that and was like, well, okay, well, we'll just shoot a lot of threes. Like Daryl Morey, now the Sixers general manager, when he was in Houston, he traded for James Harden, who was a great three-point shooter, surrounded him with other three-point shooters, and just said, that's the way we're going to beat teams. To bring it back to Caitlin, she's a wonderful, wonderful player. And when the casual fan watches Caitlin Clark on television and sees her bomb away from the logo, 3 steps over half court, pull up 3. It narrows the gap in perception between the men's game and the women's game. She doesn't look that different from Steph Curry when he's playing. It doesn't mean she could play in the NBA. It just means to the casual fan, it doesn't look any different from what I'm seeing in the NBA on my TV. And that has helped women's basketball, I think, too. There are plenty of other aspects that go into it. At the college level, the best women's players stay 3 or 4 years. So they are stars at the collegiate level and then move on to be pros. Rivalries develop. Their profiles grow. They gain Instagram followers and TikTok followers and social media followers. So they have it. Women's basketball in that regard has an advantage over the men's game at the college level, and they're able to parlay that into popularity. I think they'll parlay it into popularity over time at the WNBA level. It'll be a little more challenging because the WNBA it's got some stuff competing against it that is going to be a challenge, but I think it's kind of upwards for women's basketball in that regard. Yes.
Does the pickup game still exist?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's still plenty of great court. You go to West 4th Street in Greenwich Village, or the courts out in there are courts out in LA, courts in Philly. That was actually one of my favorite stories doing the Kobe book. That was one of my favorite stories about Kobe, was that when he was living around here, 15, 16 years old, he had a friend named Anthony Gilbert, who was a couple years older than him. Anthony was actually a student at Temple at the time. He had befriended Kobe's older sister, Sharia, and had gotten to know the family and had gotten to know Kobe. And when Kobe was, as I said, in his middle teenage years, and he didn't want to be just another kid from the suburbs who was pretty good. He wanted to be great. And he knew to be great that he had to be able to play pickup games and Sunny Hill games against the best players from the city of Philadelphia. So he and Anthony would drive around just by themselves to courts and playgrounds in and around the city. and they would play a very unique brand of basketball. Kobe would be there and he'd be working on his crossover and dunks and shooting threes and doing whatever he needed to do to work on his game. And Anthony had two jobs. He was to rebound all of Kobe's shots and pass the ball back to him. And he was to scream at him while Kobe was going through his drills. You're soft. You couldn't play in the public league. You go to a white school. Scream at him in his face. All the stuff that Kobe thought he was going to hear or was already starting to hear in terms of trash talk on the court. Because even at 15 or 16, Kobe was smart enough. He was always one step ahead of everybody. He was smart enough to know, this is what I got to steel myself against this. Because they're going to think I'm soft coming from Lower Merion and coming from Wynwood. And I can't let them think I'm soft. So, I mean, to me, if you've ever seen the video of the game he played with the Lakers, where they're playing the Orlando Magic, and the Magic had a really tough, really good, really nasty player named Matt Barnes. And Matt Barnes is standing out of bounds. He's going to inbound the ball, pass it in from out of bounds, and Kobe's standing right in front of him. They're like this. And Barnes takes the ball and pumps it right in Kobe's face, like he's going to throw it in his face. Kobe doesn't move. He does not move. And Barnes to this day talks about it. Freaking freaked me out. Like, how did he not react? But I think you can draw a line from that moment all the way back to him playing in those, in that special brand of ball with Anthony Gilbert.
Sonny Hilley.
Yeah, yes.
How about on your drive over here tonight, driving around Bala Cynwyd, did anything come back to you from your time working on Kobe?
Not especially, no. It's funny. I'm moving on to the next thing, so in a way, I'm kind of like it. What I was thinking about more than anything was like, okay, remember which chapter's which in Magic in the Air, like, because even to a certain degree, I'm like going back on this because I've moved on to the next book project that I'm doing. I was listening to the Phillies game, like, what am I going to talk about Saturday on the radio? And I had to write a column for the Inquirer today because the Flyers fired their coach, John Tortorella. So if I linger too long on what happened, then I'm going to miss something that I need to pay attention to here. In the back, yeah.
Have you written about the roots of the NBA? Philadelphia.
The spas, you mean? Are you getting the spas? I'm familiar with it, but I haven't written much about it. Although I did a piece a couple of years ago. One of the trips I took for research for the book, I did a chapter on John Morant from the Memphis Grizzlies. And I went to Murray, Kentucky, because he went to Murray State. So I spent 3 days in Murray, Kentucky, which was a trip. But one of the most significant players in Philadelphia basketball history went to Murray State, a guy named Joe Folks, who is credited with pioneering the jump shot in the 1940s and 50s, and when he played for the Warriors. So I ended up doing a little bit of research on Joe Folks while I was there, and I wrote a very long piece for the Inquirer about Joe Folks, who really had a tormented life. He was an alcoholic, and he was shot and killed, after he retired. Really kind of a type of story. Fulks, Folks. Yes. Good.
Two questions. One, how do you write a book and keep a full-time job? And two, are there any international leagues where you see a lot of competition with the NBA, or if you have any take on the international league?
First thing, I have a very understanding wife and a very understanding family. And I don't even know if I should say this. I've been around long enough with respect to the Inquirer and Philly sports that I can kind of pick my spots in terms of, okay, I can write a column in an hour if I need to, or even less than that. Just because it's what I've been doing for a long, long time. So there's that, and I don't see much.
Does you read and write?
I read and write.
How many kids?
I'm a dad. I have 2 kids, 2
How old
boys,
are they?
13 and 10.
Nice.
They're great. And then to answer your question, I don't see it necessarily an international league approaching the caliber of the NBA, because the best players are always going to come to the NBA. So I'd be surprised if there were a league, pardon me, that's true in virtually every other sport too, with the exception maybe of some of the excuse me, baseball leagues. the KHL is no match for the NHL in hockey. There really isn't a pro basketball league in the world that rivals the NBA. And that's, I mean, you could, but the NBA is that proving ground, right? I mean, you see it with the Olympics every 4 years. The gap between the US and all these other countries is narrowing because the NBA is drawing so many international players to it. And then come the Olympics, they go back and play for their home country. Yes.
Mike, where does Chocolate Thunder pantheon of all-time dunkers?
This is the most controversial part of this book. There are about 3 sentences on Darryl Dawkins' Chocolate Thunder in this book. It's the question I get asked more than any. How much Darryl Dawkins is in this book? And I keep disappointing people by saying not that much. And the reason is that I think he's a great, colorful guy, but 2 things. Number one, I didn't know what else I could say or write about him that hadn't already been said or written, and that wasn't common knowledge to somebody who might already be inclined to write the book. Some figures, I had to include Michael Jordan because he's just that significant. I had to include Julius Erving. Darryl shattered some backboards and had amazing nicknames for his dunks, but once you get beyond that, then what? Like, what else am I saying about him? And that was particularly true because of what ended up being the narrative thread of the book, which was Dunk as agent for change in basketball in America. So there's a chapter, for instance, on a guy nicknamed Dr. Dunk, Darnell Hillman, who is actually the first player to win an NBA slam dunk contest in 1977. Nobody remembers this. It was held at halftime of Game 6 of the 1977 NBA Finals between the Sixers and the Trailblazers. And Darnell Hillman was not even with an NBA team at the time that he won the NBA slam dunk contest. He had been traded to the Nets from the Pacers. He didn't want to go to the Nets. So, and he had he could exercise a clause in his contract that allowed him to not play for a team that acquired him in a trade. So instead of wearing a Pacers jersey or a Nets jersey when he did the contest, he wore the t-shirt from the softball team for the Indianapolis liquor store he was playing. It said Bottle Shop, SHOPPE on it. And that's how he wore that to win the dunk contest. Wow. So I thought that was more interesting because Hillman's background was he had served in Vietnam. He had been an undergrad at San Jose State at the same time that John Carlos and Tommy Smith were there. He was much more representative of the story I wanted to tell through the dunk than Darryl Dawkins was. So I have a line in the book. Dr. Dunk needed, before anybody could travel to Planet Lovetron, Dr. Dunk needed to come along.
In the old days, the only guys that dunked were the centers. Is that because guys like Oscar and Baylor and West were told not to? There was a catwalk.
I don't know that it was necessarily so much they were told not to. I'm sure that played into it at some level. Some of it was just kind of the one of the things I uncovered in this book is how powerful tradition and culture can be. That you don't do that simply because that's not the way it's done, right? You're right. For a long time, centers were the only ones who dunked because they were the ones closest to the basket. And if they weren't the ones dunking, well, why would a guard dunk? His job is to dribble the ball over half court and pass the ball to the big guy who's supposed to score. And it's only as the sport evolves over time and you get Elgin Baylor and you get some of the great wing players who come around in the 60s and 70s that starts to change. So yeah, I mean, that's part, like, for instance, I read over and over again how in the 40s and the 50s, it didn't occur to certain players to dunk the ball. Like, they didn't conceive of the idea that, like, jumping up, throwing it down could serve as a tool of intimidation in the sport. That changed over time as more and more Black players filtered into basketball until it kind of reaches a crescendo and really a turning point, I think, in basketball history with the 1966 national championship game between Texas Western and Kentucky. That's the game Texas Western was the first national champion to start 5 Black players. And they're playing Kentucky, who's coached by Adolph Rupp, who is the most powerful figure in college basketball at the time. And his team is all white, and he's doing everything he can to keep it that way. Starting guard on that team, best player on that team, by the way, Pat Riley. But going into the game, Don Haskins, the coach at Texas Western, told his biggest, strongest player, David Lapp, first time you touch the ball near the basket, you are to dunk it in the face of whatever Kentucky player happens to be guarding. And that was how Texas Western scored its first basket of the game, took the lead at like 3-2, and never lost the lead after that. And that's exactly what happened. The Kentucky players were intimidated by that. You know, the big bad black guy had dunked on him. And it pissed Adolph Rupp off so badly that he started lobbying for the dunk to be banned. Which is how it came to, part of the reason it came to be banned in 1967. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Bill Lyon earlier, and how was mentioned, I knew you got to know him, but I don't think we've ever spoken about the nature of that mentorship.
Oh, sure.
So I'm interested to hear a little more about that. And then second part, given the media landscape today and the state of journalism, do you think that kind of mentorship and training can exist today? It does exist from what you said?
Oh, good. That second one's a really good question. I'll tell you the story of Bill and I first. So I grew up reading him in the Inquirer every day, like a lot of you, like I know Seth did. Like, wake up in the morning, I got an hour before I go to school. If it's Tuesday, I'm reading Jason Stark's baseball notes on the inside page. I'm reading Bill Lyon, I'm reading Frank Dolson, I'm reading Phil Jasner in the Daily News, all of that. But Bill was my favorite, right? I just loved the way he told the story. He was so lyrical in the way he wrote it. So the summer between my sophomore and junior years at LaSalle, I wrote him a letter. Back when you actually did such things as write letters to people. No email, no nothing like that. And all I said was, you know, I'm an aspiring sports writer at LaSalle University. Whatever advice you can give me, I would be more than grateful for. Here, I enclosed a self-addressed stamp envelope. I said, you know, write something on a table napkin for all I care. Just, you know, I hope to hear from him. He never wrote me back. What he did instead was look my name up in directory assistance and call me on a Sunday morning. I happened to be, I had a part-time job. My uncle owned a deli in Northeast Philly, at the corner of Castro and Shellmeyer. And it was called BG's Deli. If you know where Resurrection Parish is, there's a strip mall right there. The deli was in the strip mall right by the police and fire credit union. And so that was how I earned beer money in college, was making omelets and cheesesteaks and kind of a half-ass short of a cook. And my dad called the deli on a Sunday morning. He's like, "You'll never guess who called at the house looking for you." Like, who? Bill Lyon. Oh my God, he got my letter. So I called him back. He said, "What are you doing next Friday?" I said, "Whatever you are going to have me do." You know? And he said, "Well, why don't you shadow me to a Phillies game? I have to go to a Phillies game on a Friday night." Hideo Nomo, who some of you may remember is one of the first, maybe the first Japanese pitcher to enter Major League Baseball, was pitching for the Dodgers at the time. He was a sensation. So Hideo Nomo was going to pitch on that Friday night against the Phillies at Veterans Stadium. And he said, "Why don't you come with me? And I'll show you around the ballpark." So I met him at Veterans Stadium outside the media entrance. And he took me in, and I got to meet Jim Fregosi, who was managing the Phillies at the time, Larry Boa, Darren Dalton, Jim Eisenreich. And more importantly to me, like all the guys in the press box. I got to meet Ray Dittinger for the first time. I got to meet Phil Sheridan, who was covering the Phillies for the Inquirer at the time, who I grew up reading in the Montgomery County Record and Intelligencer and Bucks County Courier Times. And in that game, it was a completely uneventful game. The Phillies scored 17 runs. They knocked Nomo out of the game. Greg Jeffries hit for the cycle, becoming the first Phillies player in 30-some years to hit for the cycle. Darren Dalton slid into second base on a double and tore ligaments in his knee and was out for the season. Jeff Judy, the Phillies starting pitcher that day, one of the colossal rockheads of Major League Baseball history, not only pitched a complete game, not only hit a grand slam in pitching a complete game, but conducted every post-game interview, and I'm not making this up, and it wowed me as a 20-year-old college kid when I saw it, with a towel wrapped around his waist, no shirt on, a cowboy hat on, and an unlit cigarette dangling from his head. So, and the best part was, though, at the end of the game, after Bill had filed his column, I had sent him samples of my writing before the game. He said, "Listen," he said, "you have some potential. Why don't we meet for lunch and we'll talk about You're right. And from that spawned a 25-year mentor-mentee relationship, until he passed away in 2019.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
For everybody? Google his eulogy on Bill Lyon. It's one of the most moving eulogies I've ever read.
Thank you, I
Right.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's nice to get it said. To answer the second question you had said, I don't know. I don't know. There's so much of what we are now, and by we, I mean reporters and people who try to commit journalism, is driven by stuff that does not matter. We're driven by what's trending on Twitter, and we're driven by, in politics, it's who won the day, like who owned somebody else on the cable TV show. And, in sports, so much now, like, I don't know, I grew up, and I'm sure a lot of you feel the same way. Like, I had favorite teams. I wanted the teams in Philadelphia to do well, but I loved like the action on the field. I loved the drama. I loved, when my team won or it came back from the bottom of the ninth inning with a dramatic game. Now, and I was interested in the athletes and the coaches. What's going on in their lives? What are their personalities like? How do they get to this level? Now, so much of it seems to me is about gambling, to be honest, because it's legal. Fantasy sports has been around for such a long time that it's kind of realigned the way people view sports. They're not interested in the backstory of the athletes unless it's to say that the athletes are wonderful people. The media landscape is changing in that regard too, where the idea of being a unattached, independent entity covering the Sixers or the Eagles or the Phillies or the Flyers or LeBron is almost like a foreign concept. In the last, I don't know how closely you've been paying attention to this, in the last couple of days, there's been this big back and forth between LeBron James and Stephen A. Smith about what Stephen has said about LeBron and his son Bronny. And it's in a way a unique case because Stephen is so well known and so powerful and such a part of the NBA that it's almost like he's part of the league and can't really cover it. But in principle, I agree completely with what he's saying, which is LeBron James should not expect to have his ass kissed all the time. No athlete should. That's at least not the way I was brought up in the business. That's not the way I felt like as a fan. I wanted honest coverage of the athletes. I wanted a columnist or a talk show guy who, if he thought that, I don't know, Nick Foles was playing badly, you say Nick Foles is playing bad, and you criticize. You're not supposed to be homers. You're not supposed to be in the bag for an athlete or a league or a team. But that expectation is out there now because media have become so fractured. And so if you write for a website that is geared to Philadelphia Eagles fans or Philadelphia Sixers fans, you're probably not going to be incentivized to tell them things they don't want to hear. But that's not your job. Your job, if you're a journalist, quote unquote, I kind of hate that word, like, supposed to be honest. Supposed to be telling, well, here's what's really going on, or here's my opinion in good faith. I'm not trying to get clicks. I'm not trying to get on an athlete's good side. I'm not trying to, take up for somebody on the team. I'm just trying to call it the way I see it. And I think we're missing a lot of that because the poles of that are what drive engagement and they drive the economic model of it now. It's all about the content itself as opposed to, to be honest, back in the day with the newspaper, like the coupons or the classified ads, and then just reading, all the articles to get a sense of what's going on in the world. That kind of relative indifference doesn't sell subscriptions or get clicks in it. Whether you're talking about sports, whether you're talking about politics, any of that stuff.
Thanks for letting me go a second time.
Sure, it's okay.
Getting back to basketball, one of my favorite players was Mo Cheeks. And probably the only time he ever dunked
Was at the end of Game 4 in 1983. Yeah.
Prior to that play, by the way, was my favorite play when he held it, and he dished it to Moses Malone.
Yes.
He slammed, and that's when we knew he had it.
Mhm.
That was 1983. The Sixers have not won an NBA championship.
No, they have not.
Doesn't look like there's.
Not only have they not won an NBA championship, they have only been to the conference finals twice.
Wait a minute, 67 they won.
No, since then, I'm
Since
saying,
83.
yeah, since 83. They went to the conference finals in 85 and lost to the Celtics. And they went in 2001 when they beat the Bucks and went on to the finals.
So what do you think's going on with the six,
I mean,
look for their whole
what is
future?
there to say, right? I mean, when you have a player like Joel Embiid, you're either all in or you're not in at all. They went all in, with this contract extension that he signed last offseason. He's thinking that that his body would adjust to the problems with the left knee. And it simply has not. It simply is not. Now, you can blame, some of that blame gets put on Joel, and I get that, and he's certainly deserving of some of it. I give him a little more grace than I think a lot of other people do, because there's like a law of diminishing returns with certain players. Like I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. Yao Ming was an incredibly great player for the Rockets for about a 5-year period. And I talked to Jeff Van Gundy about this, that Van Gundy told me that Yao wanted to play every day. He wanted to practice every day, and he wanted to play every game. And he did everything in his power to do that. He was so well conditioned. And he still broke his toe and injured his knee and broke his foot and had 5 full seasons, really, when he was at his peak. Joel's gotten numb by load managing and sitting out games, and he even had his face broken a couple of times when it wasn't his fault and things like that. So maybe this was as good as it was ever going to get for anybody to expect. Like the idea of expecting him to dominate the league for 6 or 7 years, winning 3 championships, staying healthy all that time. Maybe it was a little too much, because there have been other big men who have fallen apart. Brad Doherty, Bill Walton, we all know the names. We can go down the list. So there's that. So you're stuck with Joel. And I think their best hope in that regard is, as terrible as it sounds, they wait until February. He goes a year without playing. And if somehow there's a clause in the collective bargaining agreement that if the player goes a year and doesn't play because of an injury, he and the team can agree to void his contract against the salary cap. Meaning that if in a year's time, Joel can't play, and he acknowledges that he can't play, and the Sixers acknowledge that he can't play, he will get all his money. He'll get the $193 million, but it won't count against the salary cap for the Sixers. Okay, and I think that's a very real possibility. They're doing what they have to do right. They are tanking. It's the best thing they've done all season. They're great at it. They're great at it. They have a lot of practice, but they're great at it.
They all come back healthy next year,
Who's they all? Paul George isn't gonna be back. No, they're gonna get him out. They're gonna get him out.
Maxey.
You dump him, whatever anybody will give you for Paul George, if there's a way to do it, you do it.
Who's gonna take that salary though?
You find somebody. And if they can't, then they'll come up with something, he'll be a bench player. Yeah, maybe the Clippers will do it. You have to get a top 6 pick, and you have to hope that you get a player who can play right away and really contribute in the way that Jared McCain was doing before he got hurt.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a long road back.
Still think Nick Nurse will keep coaching?
No. I don't.
Really?
I don't.
Did they let Joe play in the Olympics?
Should they have let Joel play in the Olympics? I did not have.
Player on the team.
I did not have a problem. Number one, I think it's misconstruing. I think it's kind of a misnomer to say, were they right to let him play? If he wants to play, he can play. Should he have played? I didn't have a big problem here. I thought there was more to be gained by him being around LeBron and Steph and KD. Because that had happened in the past. That happens with virtually every Olympic team. Guys get around a Kobe, a Michael, whoever the best player is in the league at the time, and they see his work habits and some of it rubs off. It's happened time and memorial. It didn't happen, and it didn't help him, health-wise. It didn't. Yes.
I read just today, someone's starting a rumored trade, Sixers trade Tyrese Maxey for Zion Williamson.
No, they're not going to.
God forbid.
No, they're not going to do that. Tyrese Maxey's gonna be the face of the franchise.
He should be.
Absolutely. He should be. So that would, yeah, Zion, you don't know what you're getting at
No.
time. So, somebody else had a
We
hand up.
just played the Pelicans, we lost. And to the
Anything else?
Wizards.
Yes,
Right.
yes, sir. Do you have your hand up, question?
Oh,
Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am,
This is a totally different topic,
that's okay.
but, I wondered if you had, an opinion about transgender athletes.
Hmm. It's good that
College
we saved the boring stuff for last.
professional.
Oh, boy. I'm, at one level, I am. The disingenuousness on both sides of the debate really bothers me. Because this does not happen all that frequently. It really does not. And yet, the side that's against it treats it like it's an affront to, it's the biggest problem we have going on in our country. And the side that's in favor of it treats it like it's the next phase of the civil rights movement. And it's just not happening frequently enough to me that it creates this incredibly divisive and vitriolic debate. If I'm pushed, I think, generally speaking, in most sports, biological men should play with biological men, and biological females should play with biological females. The Leah Thomas situation, the swimmer at Penn, is the one that comes up all
Right,
the time.
right.
And I think it was a particularly problematic example for, and this it should go without saying, of course, compassion, love, equal rights, of course, for people who are living that lifestyle. But there are biological realities in a lot of sports. And with the Leah Thomas situation, she did not begin transitioning. From everything I've read of the science, she began transition so late in her life that it was unfair to the biologically female swimmers who were competing against her. She was a mediocre to below average Division I swimmer when she identified as male. She was incredibly well above average, setting records as a female, because at the time of her transition, she had the testosterone in her body for all of it. And I think some of this comes down to, a little bit of this comes down to willful ignorance on people's parts. And here's what I mean by that, because you asked about Caitlin Clark earlier. When the NBA draft happened last year, and Caitlin Clark was coming out, she had finished at Iowa, and she was going to enter the WNBA draft. There was actually on our Slack channel, our internal instant messaging channel in the Inquirer, in our sports department, about whether the Sixers should draft Caitlin Clark. And it was being discussed, like, seriously among people in our department. And I couldn't take it anymore. And I said, Caitlin Clark would not last 30 seconds on an NBA basketball court before somebody caved her face in with an elbow. That's the reality. And that's the way, from everything I've read, that's the way the curve works. The NBA athletes are at the highest possible end of athleticism and strength and speed. So the cross-section of society that they're drawing from is so much stronger, faster, better, bigger than everybody else, that the idea that Caitlin Clark is going to go there and compete against them is ridiculous on its face. She's an amazing female basketball player. She is. Serena Williams has said this. Somebody asked her about, why don't you consider yourself the best tennis player in the world? You always call yourself the best female tennis player. And she said, because if I faced off against an average men's player on the tour, he would beat me 6-love in 15 minutes. And it doesn't mean that women's sports isn't amazing. It doesn't mean that we should, it doesn't mean a lot of things. But we end up getting caught in these hot button topics, and we dig in and we got to maintain our side, even if it means we say something completely ridiculous. Like, I don't think, to the flip side, like, I don't think Leah Thomas necessarily wanted to, like, make a spectacle of herself, or I don't think most transgender people who are competing in sports are doing this to like take opportunities away from girls. They're not being malicious about it, but that's how it gets framed from the other side too. It's like, they're taking opportunities away from our girls, these terrible people. They're dealing with stuff. They're dealing with stuff. And everybody just needs to freaking calm down.
Thank you.